Welcome, everyone. This is the American Society of International Law, Women in International Law Interest Group Career Roundtable. It is really a pleasure and a joy to welcome you all to this conversation. My name is Hannah Garry. I am a co-chair of WILIG, along with Valerie Oosterveld, professor at Western Law in Canada. And I'm clinical professor of law and director for the International Human Rights Clinic at USC Gould School of Law, as well as faculty director for the Justice and Accountability Initiative. I really want to thank particularly one of our members, Lauren Hughes, who played a huge role, really did all of the work behind this webinar and organizing us. I want to appreciate all of her efforts. As well as my co-chair for thinking through the organization for today's panel. A thank you as well to all the WILIG mentors and mentees who have joined us today as part of WILIG's mentorship program. So WILIG is, as I said, an interest group that's part of the American Society. We consist of hundreds of members. We're one of the oldest interest groups that organize a lot of programming focused on amplifying and supporting women in their work and their careers in international law, while also making sure that all that we do addresses issues around gender in international law. And I just want to flag briefly some of our programs that are coming up for you to note. In particular, we will be co-sponsoring a couple of events at the upcoming American branch of the International Law Association weekend in New York City, a networking coffee for women in international law, as well as a panel that my co-chair is presenting on. We are also putting out soon a call for our Prominent Women in International Law Award, which is one of our signature programming events, and we always present that award on an annual basis at our luncheon at the annual meeting at the American Society in Washington, D.C. So I encourage you to look out for announcements around that, as well as some of our upcoming webinars on the Draft Crimes Against Humanity Treaty and other issues this fall and next spring. The way you can tap into our network is join, first and foremost. And so I just encourage you all to consider being a member if you are not yet. And that simply just involves becoming a member of this amazing American Society of International Law that has thousands of members, almost half of which are outside of the United States. And when you become an ASIL member, then you can join WILIG as well. We have a listserv, we have a web page, and we also have a group on LinkedIn that you can join as part of that and stay on top of all of our events and tap in to our mentoring programs as well. So after I briefly introduce our speakers for today's webinar, I'll pose a number of questions to the participants for the first part of the panel, and then we'll allow time for a Q&A after that from all of you, time permitting. So I just want to invite you, if you have any questions that come up as the panelists are speaking, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screens in the Zoom chat, and I will be happy to read those out during the Q&A portion of our event. I'm going to keep the introductions today brief so that we have time to pose some of our questions to the participants, as we only have an hour, while still giving you all a sense of the array of the amazing women that we have with us today. Unfortunately, I have to note that one of our panelists, Kelsey Glover from the Office of International Corporate Finance at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, is unable to join us today. She sends her deep regrets, and we're wishing her and our U.S. government colleagues all the best right now during this shutdown. So in no particular order, our speakers today are, first off, Judge Margaret DeGuzman, who's been a judge on the UN International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals since December 2021. She is also a professor of law at Temple University at Beasley School of Law in Philadelphia in the United States, and she co-directs Temple's Institute for International Law and Public Policy. We'll also hear from Professor Denise Gilman, who is clinical professor of law and director of the Immigration Clinic at University of Texas, Austin School of Law, where she has taught and promoted international human rights for non-citizens since 2007. And last and certainly not least, we will also be hearing from Kirsty Sutherland, who is a barrister at 9BR Chambers in London, where she advises on international public law, international criminal law, and military law. So I just want to stop and say a big thanks to all of you for taking time. I know you have a lot going on in your schedules and taking time to be with us today. So turning to our questions, let's start with career trajectory. Perhaps we could talk a bit about what drew you to work in the field of international law and how you arrived at the position that you have today. So Meg, do you want to take us away?
Sure. Thank you so much, Hannah. And let me just start by saying how thrilling it is to be on this panel, which I had the honor to organize a few times when I was in the leadership of WILIG, and trying to figure out who some very impressive women are who could inspire younger generations. So to be asked, really feels like an honor. So thank you for including me. I really came to international law because of some childhood experiences where we traveled, and my father teaches Italian, and we lived in Italy when I was little, and did a lot of traveling, and just fell in love with the adventure of exploring the world and getting to know different people and places. And then as I got older, I realized that there were so many exciting intellectual pursuits in things international. But going to law school was really motivated by wanting to help people. And I know that a lot of my students come to law school for that reason. And they think to themselves, as I did at the time, how could I use my skills, the talents, the gifts that I've been given to help people? And since I had already an interest in things international, and I spoke 5 languages by then because I had spent some time in other countries, I thought, well, one way is to do something international. So a lot of it then after that had to do with serendipity, sort of being in a good place at a good time. So, for example, when I was in law school in my first summer, um, somebody happened to mention to me that they had worked at the Yugoslav Tribunal. And I thought, okay, well, that's, a way of doing something related, it seemed to me at the time, to human rights and in an international context. So I did that as well. And then the next summer, the Rome Statute of the ICC was being negotiated, and I was offered an opportunity to go and advise the Senegal delegation in those negotiations. And that put me on this trajectory toward international criminal law in particular. I had gone to law school thinking more human rights, development, some international way of helping people that wasn't too specific. And then the fact that I was living through this time of a lot of generative work in international criminal law kind of led me in that direction. So one message I would have for those sort of starting out in their careers is sort of go with the flow in some ways, like follow the path that seems to be unfolding. And then also I had a lot of support. So I think my other message would be like, you know, consider yourself to be part of a community that really wants to uplift you and to support you. And I had a lot of people along the way who helped to shape and guide the path that I took and to encourage me. So a combination of kind of personal interests and serendipity and support is sort of how I ended up where I am.
Thank you. Very well summarized. Denise.
Yes, I also really want to just extend my thanks to the organizers of the panel for including me in it. I feel a bit like the poser down here doing more immigration related work, but I do see it as one of the major human rights issues of our time. So I'll go ahead and plug into the discussion from that perspective. I, similar to Meg, actually do trace back my interest in international human rights law to travel with my family as a child, mostly in Mexico. My dad was a photographer, and so we spent a lot of time just wandering streets of Mexican towns and even spending some entire summers there, and became very interested in the language and the dynamics of what we were seeing. And so when I went to law school, I was quite interested in international law from the beginning. And I didn't really know what that meant at the time. I think it's fair to say I just knew I wanted to do something international, something sort of Latin Americanist. But quickly found my way to international human rights law at a time when it was also similar to what Meg is saying, sort of very much still inchoate, in development. And I found that to be fascinating, the possibility of both using legal skills to do good work, but also to help to develop the legal standards that would be used in the field. So I was at Columbia Law, and there was a human rights internship program. So felt fortunate just to be able to be sent, really having done nothing to earn it up to that point, to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica, which was still sort of a house with open doors when hearings were being held, now much fancier. And then I wanted to continue on with the Inter-American human rights system, so I went to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in DC after law school and after a clerkship for a year. And I was there for about 5 years doing work on Colombia and Guatemala mostly. And then I sort of decided that I wanted to see the inside of a US courtroom. I wanted to see what it felt like to practice law in the US, not just in international fora. And so I went to a civil rights organization in DC, the Washington Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, but heading up their immigrant and refugee rights project, which I saw as being the perfect bridge between international human rights law and more domestic sort of implementation of outlaw. I remember I put in my cover letter to the Washington Lawyers Committee that I wanted to transition to doing more domestic work. And they were like, what's domestic work? If you're not sort of in the international human rights sphere, that distinction itself sounds kind of funny. They were thinking about, you want to do family law? What is it that you would like to do? But I do really see that immigration work is a realm where we get to use international norms such as the Refugee Convention, as well as international human rights instruments, and then also comparative law, looking at what other nations are doing on migration issues and bringing that all into U.S. courtrooms, whether it's immigration courts on the ground or federal courts in developing asylum and immigration law standards as well. So I did that for quite a while, and then mostly focused on asylum cases and working with firms to do pro bono representation. And then I got the teaching bug. So I wanted to transition from kind of that world of international human rights, bridging to immigration into teaching. And I've been teaching asylum and immigration law clinics for 20 years now. And I regularly get the opportunity to use international human rights norms in the various work that we do, in the cases that we do, helping to teach the students the way to navigate that bridge between the two worlds. And also occasionally pretty regularly actually, bringing immigration rights related cases still to international fora. So bringing cases to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights relating to asylum shutdown at the border or immigration detention, individual cases or larger impact matters that were family separation. We brought a precautionary measures case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So I feel very fortunate to be able to mix the worlds, and also to teach refugee law outside of the clinic setting as well, which also brings things together. So that's a bit about my trajectory.
Thank you so much, Denise, and I really appreciate your leadership on the whole movement around, implementation of human rights norms on domestic issues. There's a whole network known as the Bringing Human Rights Home network and movement that has built up over the past couple of decades. I know when I was starting my own clinic, that was at the top of mind, was make sure that we're, focused on issues right here in our backyard, not just thinking about things outside of the United States. So really appreciate your leadership on that. Kirsty.
Well, it's, as everyone said, a huge pleasure to have been invited to speak to you all. I think that the more we can encourage young women into this sort of dynamic and quite exciting field, then the better. It's also pretty embarrassing to come after Denise and Meg, who've had such an impressive career path, but echoing both of them and Denise in particular, I'm jealous of your time wandering around Mexico. I grew up in various places around the world, and I think that very international upbringing and the immersion that I had in different cultures and the wild experiences of my childhood. I played with Afghan children in refugee camps when my mother was working there. My brother and I were evacuated from Syria when the first Gulf War started, and my parents made sure that we were really kind of immersed in wherever we lived. We lived mainly in Syria and Pakistan, but immersed in local languages, learned all the cultural rules, all these things. And for me, this fostered, I think, a really keen awareness of and interested in how states differ, how they serve their populations, what war really means for people. And for me, that was the children that I was playing with, their mothers trying to teach them in a camp, and my mother trying to buy books for them and taking me to the market with her. And I think I was also, through those experiences, made keenly aware that I was afforded a voice as a sort of European girl child who was being sent to school and educated and had certain expectations of me, when many others were really not. So I think it was pretty clear to me very young that I wanted to do something international, definitely something related to states, and definitely something with a focus on war. But having been told my whole life that I would be a barrister, the last thing I ever wanted to do was become a lawyer. So I studied philosophy and then anthropology at university, and I was working with a few NGOs. And then I was on the borderland with Thailand and Myanmar when Cyclone Nargis hit Myanmar. And I was suddenly pulled in to a bunch of meetings at the US Embassy, and all these NGOs were sort of chatting and chatting and chatting. And I apologize for any noise from my very noisy road outside. And then at the back of the room, there were these people who at the end of the meeting, they hadn't really said anything. And they just said, okay, so we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to have these consequences. And they just sort of fixed the whole thing. and I thought, who are these people? And I want to do that kind of behind the scenes, very effective work. And they were the lawyers. So I phoned my father in floods of tears saying I'm going to go to law school, and he sort of couldn't really understand why I was crying. But so then I became a barrister, and for me it was international law or nothing, actually. And I think that single-mindedness was probably important at that point in my career, because it's such it can be a very tricky business to get into. I then did the usual thing of getting a UN internship and working in the international tribunals, which I'm not sure how it is at the moment, but certainly was a requirement in my day. So I was working out in Cambodia at a time when Cambodia was very obviously post-conflict and very new, which was very exciting in some ways and very challenging in others. And I'm happy to talk about that later. But yeah, while I was an intern, I was then offered pupillage as an international criminal law pupil, which was an experiment at the time. So incredibly lucky, on the tiny defense team for President Kenyatta at the ICC. And I think because of my professional background and the experiences I'd had, they sort of trusted me to go out to Kenya and do the investigations. So that's sort of how I spent my pupillage. And I was tasked with interviewing really quite sinister people and investigating and drafting really complex legal arguments because it was a very, very small team. So we had a lot of work, very little sleep, but also it gave me a huge amount of experience. And then when that case collapsed, I was immediately asked to head up a newly forming team in Cambodia for case 4. And then when that case collapsed, I was doing some academic work as well. I was asked to go to The Hague to jump onto the Al Hassan defense team. And when I left that case and finished the work I was doing there, I was then asked to go and advise the FCDO. So I think that it's not very helpful as an example because I've just been insanely lucky in several ways. But I don't want it to sound as though it was lucky, just lucky, or that it was easy, because I have to emphasize it was all pretty stressful, and there were a lot of periods of extreme self-doubt, no idea if the next case is coming or when that might be, whether a lot of questioning about whether I was the right person to be in that seat, heading up a defense team in Cambodia. I was one of the first female team leaders, and there were cultural reasons that was very problematic because in Cambodian culture, women can't disagree with senior men. And so there were peculiarities about that. In Al Hassan, I questioned whether I think it was one of the first teams at the ICC to have 2 female lead counsel. And there were problems in the courtroom with that about the level of authority I could assert and this sort of thing. So it did make me wonder if I should step aside. Ultimately, I decided to sort of stay the course as a woman because I thought that was ultimately more important for the field as a whole, but it was a really serious ethical question for me. And I have to say that the impact of the way my practice has developed, it's very knee-jerk, and suddenly you get deployed onto another case and you have to travel for a long time, and that has an impact on your personal life. So I don't want to pretend that it's been an easy glide through these big cases. I have been extremely lucky, and I've had a lot of support from people who've wanted to help me succeed, as Meg and Denise were both emphasizing, and that's something I'm extremely keen to pass on. But it is a field that demands a lot of you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, and we're so grateful you said yes to pass along some of the wisdom in this webinar. Maybe if I can just stay with you for a minute. So you flagged a bit, the challenges, some of the cultural challenges and issues you faced while you were at the Cambodia Tribunal. I'm just wondering if you can speak to us a little bit more broadly about, in your career so far, how you've seen challenges or opportunities that women in particular face in international law and the international legal profession, and how intersectionality impacts those questions.
Well, thanks. I'm sure Meg and Denise will have their own insights to provide as well, because they've certainly well, they are the shoulders we stand on, frankly, my generation. But yeah, I think women have been the lifeblood of my work, to be honest. They hold, it seems to me in my experience, although I think it was pretty different when I started out. I think now it's quite clear that women hold the whole field together. That's my experience. Things have definitely changed. As I said, there was an expectation when I first started in the ECCC that you sort of would hook up with your supervisor there, and there were pretty much no female team leaders. Complaints about sexual misconduct could mean career-ending backlash, and that was the environment that was sort of normal at that point. And I think things have definitely moved. I'm not going to suggest that there are certainly still problems, and I'd like to see women all across the leadership boards, but it does feel like a very different climate, and sexual harassment is taken much more seriously. I think we can see from what's been going on at the ICC that there's still a distance to go on victim support and protections, but lessons seem to be being learned, and I do think it's a just different cultural environment. I personally, when I was training as an advocate in the English system, where we just do a lot of quite ruthless and demeaning advocacy training, I was told explicitly, repeatedly, you need to boom it out like the boys. You've got to compete with the men in the courtroom, and this is you just have to kind of affect this sort of masculine demeanor. But I was also quietly taken aside by several very senior female barristers and judges, and I was told a number of times, keep the way you speak in the courtroom, because the field is changing. It has to change. Just hold the course. And I think that was some of the best advice I was ever given, because it just was a little bit, it's your responsibility, but I think that's just something that you have to carry when you are constantly on the vanguard. I think it's now recognized that women make fantastic advocates and, are obviously brilliant drafters and can be brilliant interviewers and investigators in a way that previously wasn't necessarily obviously recognized. And I don't want to generalize or stereotype, but I think there are really important ways that women have an advantage in access to vulnerable populations. For me, a lot of the work that I do is sort of focused on women who've been sexually attacked or with children. I also do a lot of work with soldiers with really severe PTSD or combat fatigue, and there are lots of sensitivities around how you question these people, how you handle them, how you watch them in the courtroom. I'm sure Meg will have comments on that. And I was in a lengthy sort of several-day interview with a non-state armed group fighter in Mali, and the prosecution had sent, this was a defense interview of a prosecution witness, which is an unusual thing. So the prosecution had sent one of their investigators along to sort of sit in, and he was on loan from the French Serious Crimes Division and had a lot of very interesting experience. And he was a sort of burly bear of a man, and I'm tiny and sparrow-like. And he and I were chatting, and he said that he had always used his physicality in an interview to really kind of get the information out of people. But he noticed how I spent the whole morning just in rapport building and all the rest of it. And then we had lunch, and I asked about his kids, and and afterwards he gave me so much more information. And he was sort of, and I was like, well, there you go. That's you've got to use what you've got, kind of thing. And I do think, I don't want to generalize, but I do think it's we have greater access. And my accidental specialism that's arisen from the work that I've done is now handling vulnerable witnesses. And I suspect that comes a lot from the diminutive manner that I was criticized for right at the beginning of my career. And I wish that weren't the case, but the reality is that is relatively gender specific. So on the intersectionality point, and I hope everyone who's working in international law is, but I suppose they're not, conscious of the importance of representation and genuine respect for minorities. To be honest, it's been a great joy of my work that I have been able to learn from and work with such extraordinary people from everywhere. My childhood and certainly my work in Myanmar and then Cambodia has really instilled in me a real drive to prioritize local views and approach it as lending support when welcomed and genuinely useful. So I think the international legal community, how I've experienced it, is a really exciting example of this sort of crazy melting pot and an opportunity to share ideas. I've mentioned the sensitivities, cultural sensitivities that made some of my work in Cambodia a little bit difficult. not only could I not disagree with a man, I also couldn't disagree as an unmarried woman with a married woman. So there are these sort of peculiarities that you just have to navigate. I've definitely been spoken down to as a woman by men in the courtroom from all over the world. But similarly, I've seen African lawyers demeaned by European lawyers, which is obviously completely unacceptable. But I think ultimately reflects far worse on the demeanor than the demeanee. It's something, yeah, I mean, it's something I think we're, again, beginning to tackle more head on, but it is a great joy working in such a culturally rich environment. I think we just have to make sure that people have the right attitude to that and seek to learn from it. I've learned the most from Kenyan lawyers. I tell them that all the time. They're the best, the best I've ever seen. But yeah, going back to the original question, I think that the sisterhood in this field is exceptional, and it's an honor for me to call the women that I work with my friends and have their endless support and wisdom. And I think we need more and more of those women to help us break the glass ceilings that remain. So please join us, please.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. And that's a great segue to my next question, which is for Denise, with regard to the role mentoring played and is continuing to play perhaps in your career trajectory, and how, if at all, have other women supported you throughout your career?
Yeah, I wanted to start by saying thank you for the question. I wanted to start by saying that as we're talking, I hope we're not giving a bit of an impression that to get into this field, you have to have already by the age of 10, had impressive international experiences. And this connects to the mentorship question because, I do feel that that time hanging out in Mexico was important. But to be really clear, I came from a small Texas town with a small rural high school. And I think if I hadn't been exposed to women mentors doing this kind of work, that I would never have assumed that it was something that I could do. So that it definitely didn't come from the world, so to speak. For me, my most important early mentor was a woman that I worked with during college summers who was an immigration lawyer, so not really a human rights lawyer. But first, she was a lawyer. So it hadn't even really occurred to me that I could be a lawyer until I worked with her, much less doing work in another language that had all of these international components to it. So that's what encouraged me to go to law school. And then once I was in law school, I had some opportunities to be exposed to other human rights work and realities that had some mentorship from women. And then actually, as I was thinking about it as we were talking, quite a bit of mentorship from men, I do have to say. And I think that's because at the time that I was starting out at the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American Commission, it was all men. It really was. And so I am very glad to see that changing. But it is certainly the case that I did also have opportunities to see new things that I wouldn't have had if it weren't for bosses in general of both genders who were willing to allow me a chance to see those things and get involved. I will say that because it was largely men when I started out my career, it became very critical to have not just kind of mentors, women above me or mentors above me, but also to have the cohort of women supporting one another. And that has definitely always been the case because while it was still heavily men dominated, there was a whole group of us that were, coming up, women supporting one another. And those are really lifelong relationships. I mean, I'm thinking about those early years, well, even the summers during law school and then early years after law school. And those are still people I count on regularly. I was a candidate for the U.S. nomination to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights a couple of years ago, not pre-Trump. Immediately those who jumped in with encouragement and advice and mooting and the rest were all women. Somebody that I worked with ages ago who's now a judge on the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, somebody who was, ambassador to the OAS for the US years ago, those kinds of things. So I would definitely encourage everybody to look around and see who's in your peer group that you can develop strong connections with, and try to make those to be lifelong connections. I guess that's where I'd leave it for now.
Thank you, Denise. And I can echo that right now. A lot of my partnerships on work through the clinic are with former classmates in law school who are women and who are now leading top organizations in human rights. And it's been such a joy to do that in solidarity together. So now I want to turn to Meg, and maybe we can step back a little bit just to think about, this kind of geopolitical moment that we're in. The title for this webinar is about current challenges with regard to trying to pursue careers in international law. So for you specifically, how have the recent challenges impacted your area of practice and scholarship? And which areas of international law do you see expanding in the future? And then I'll take the same question to the rest of the panel, if you don't mind, because we all have different areas that we work in, and some of these challenges we're seeing obviously having a lot of impact in the public sector, case in point with Kelsey not being able to join us today, but also impact, beyond the United States. So with that, Meg, can you kick us off?
Sure. If you don't mind, I just want to briefly add something to the comments that have been made, the excellent comments that have been made about what it has been like to be a woman in this field, specifically with regard to being a judge. This is something I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A if people have questions. But I purposely didn't talk about how I got to be a judge, because that really what felt like it was largely serendipity. And it wasn't something that I aspired to, or that I would necessarily think it would be possible to have a path toward the way that system is set up. However, I did want to say that I definitely still encountered some of the challenges that Kirsty was talking about being on the bench. And, things have gotten much better since I started, and sort of the amount of harassment and condescension and things like that that I experienced as a more junior lawyer. I didn't haven't as much, both because things have gotten better to some extent, and also because I've gotten more senior, I suppose it's fair to say. But I just want to say that from the perspective of being on the bench, the other thing that I think is important to think about is how women relate to one another and how women relate to the process differently than what was the norm, or is still the norm, but is the shifting norm. And I wanted to sort of echo what Kirsty was saying about the importance of women leaning into their natural voices and not trying to emulate some kind of male model or dominant way of doing things. And to say that from the perspective of being on the bench now, it is incredibly effective. And particularly in my field of international criminal law, where I think one of the most important practices is a practice of empathy. And I think that practice is one that often comes more naturally to women, for, many reasons, including socialization reasons. And it's one that can be downplayed or resisted if we think about trying to fit into a dominant mold that doesn't center empathy as part of the practice of law, as part of the practice of advocacy. And so that's just, sorry to not yet quite answer your question, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that I think women have some important skills and attributes that are not necessarily valued, that we have to or that we should bring to the center of these conversations, and and stimulate additional conversation about, and encourage valuing of. So with that being said, your substantive question about how the field is changing is dramatically, right? So I'm in the field of international criminal law for the past almost couple of decades. And at the beginning of my career, it was the up and coming thing, right? It was the new way of doing human rights, which some people pushed back against. Even at the time, I remember one of my law school classmates sort of really saying, why do you want to go into international criminal law? You're a human rights lawyer. This is not human rights. And at the time I said, no, this is, we're going to deter massive human rights violations. What could be more human rightsy than that? Um, so I think that is changing in a couple of ways. First of all, the international criminal law accountability structure is under attack in very clear, obvious ways, right? Including most obviously, most visibly, the ICC sanctions that the Trump administration has issued, and the sort of reduction in funding for various institutions in addition to the ICC, not just the UN, but there are other tribunals that people are trying to stand up. The Tribunal for Aggression in Ukraine. There's a tribunal for serious crimes in the Gambia. And they're just not receiving either the funding or the kind of political will that was possible back in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, when the ad hocs were stood up, the ICC and then the hybrids. So we're in a very, very different world than we were when I started my career, or frankly, for most of my career, where and I would say, I'm often tempted to wonder whether this is just part of the natural ebb and flow of things, right? Because we've seen support for these kind of global institutions ebb and flow over the years and with different kinds of political regimes. At the same time, this feels very different, right? I want to acknowledge that I think for many of us, it feels like the entire global justice architecture is under attack right now in a more multifaceted way than ever before. Right? We had sanctions against the ICC before, but now we have states withdrawing from the court. We have um, states saying that they wouldn't arrest somebody who's under an arrest warrant by the ICC if they can, including states that very much support the ICC in other contexts, saying that they wouldn't arrest Netanyahu if he came to their territories and so forth. So it feels like the regime itself is under attack. And as an optimist by nature, I want to say two things. One, I think there still is a lot of support. And I just gave a series of lectures on the support that remains for the norms that are at the heart of all of this. I think the human rights norms, the accountability norms, the justice norms that undergird the regime are still very much supported around the world. And states make statements about it. The treaties are still very much alive. Lots of them have, virtually the entire world as states parties to the treaties. The ICC has 125, I think it is, states parties at this point. So the norms themselves, I think, remain vigorous. The problem is one of enforcement, and it's one of state priorities that is under attack in lots of ways, including because of nationalism and rising authoritarianism, right? And so whether this is, how existential is this threat, I don't know, right? And I don't know if any of us know quite yet whether this is an existential threat. One thing that I will say, again, by way of sort of being an optimist by nature, is that I think some good things may come out of this, including broadening ideas about what accountability means and ought to mean. we've had a focus for these past couple of decades really on accountability and punishment, criminal accountability, as the gold standard for justice. And I see that really shifting. And I see a reinvigoration of ideas about restorative justice, about reparations, about rehabilitation. The example that I'm most interested in at the moment, because I'm writing about it, is the Colombian um, peace process and how Colombia was really able to take a holistic view of what could assist society to move forward after a 60-year civil war, an incredibly violent war for 60 years, and didn't just, and in fact, really pushed back against the dominant norms of criminal accountability. And so I see there being space. And I actually just this morning was on a panel at a conference where Valerie Osterwalder, your co-chair, was also on the possibilities of peace in the 21st century, thinking about, what can we do to center love and a feminist ethics of care as we think about the new possibilities that might open up if this regime does in fact start to pull apart. And so I can say more about that in Q&A, but I should stop now.
Thank you so much for that, Meg. And I just want to say what you led with discussing empathy and discussing, how, without being too overly broad, that this is somewhat of a strength, right? That women in particular bring, and that, that very ethic of empathy is under attack at the moment, right? So in terms of what it means to be a powerful nation, and pulling back from ideals of empathy, and that indirectly, is obviously something that impacts us as women trying to do this work in international law. Kirsty and Denise, I wanted to give you both the opportunity, if you want, to chime in on this question around the impact on your career in this moment, if any.
I might say a few words if that's all right. I just want to, it will not be nearly as well thought out as what Meg just shared, because I do think that's a really helpful way to think about what's happening. But I want to mention some things that have been happening here in Texas and in the United States around migrants' rights, and note the extent to which these do have really genuine professional impacts, both in terms of opportunities to do the work and in terms of stress, and really just kind of lifting that up and validating what people may be feeling and thinking about the stressors that are put on us. So here in Texas, we've actually been already experimenting with some of the types of reactions to work on behalf of migrants and international human rights work that we're now seeing at the federal level. We've been practicing it for a little while. There were already efforts at the state level to engage in enforcement actions to try to shut down organizations that were doing work on behalf of migrants, invoking everything from tax laws to licensing laws and the like. And there were also very significant efforts to engage in highly punitive actions towards migrants, towards refugee flows, including through a state level arrest program known as Operation Lone Star. And then also a state law that so far has been enjoined, but that also would seek to create a state level deportation force. So we were sort of already seeing some of what we're now seeing on the national level happening, as well as, by the way, some state level restrictions on academic freedom for the academic community. Cutting back on and prohibiting DEI programs and the like at earlier stages than what we're now seeing federally, that does impact the kind of research that we're doing in this field and the kind of thinking that we're doing. And then this spring, as the federal government also began to engage in the same kind of reactions to the work that I do and that others do, we saw a ramping up of it in Texas as well. So at the state level, there was legislation proposed, for example, to prohibit the use of any public funding to serve migrants, provide legal services to migrants, which would have effectively shut down my clinic. Now, it has not passed, but all of that creates an operating environment, to say the least, which is hard, right? And it also means that all of a sudden, where there were many, many jobs, frankly, in migration rights, those have shrunk quite significantly. So it is just a harder realm to get into right now. Not impossible, and the need greater than ever, right? Because of all of the restrictions on those who've been doing the work, as well as the more aggressive treatment of migrants, shutdown of the southern border, exportation of our borders to Central America and beyond. The work is more important than ever. I mean, personally, I've sort of just come to a landing place of I'm going to have a level of stress, but I also can only do the right thing to do, which is to sort of be a zealous advocate, be an ethical, zealous advocate, and hope that that doesn't land me in the crosshairs. And if it does, then, you know, that's the world that we're living in. Just a couple of thoughts on that.
Thank you, Denise. And we're here in solidarity with you. We do a little immigration work in my clinic as well, and it's important now more than ever. I find that immigration lawyers are effectively human rights defenders at this moment in time, and it's really important for all of us to be together and standing up for each other. Kirsty, did you want to comment on this question in particular?
I'll be very brief because it would be really interesting to get to some more fascinating questions. I've just been typing away in the comment section. Yeah, I think just 2 points. One thing I wanted to note was the work that I've been doing, helping with investigations into what's going on in Sudan, has seen a real shift, because I mean people are endangering themselves even more to get information out. Without any kind of security, without any kind of basic support, and you know, even $100 would allow them to do their work with more security for 2 months. You know, the sums are not large. I think that the way that the US funding cuts were done was not ideal, would be one way of putting it. But one interesting feature has been the forcing of coalition building. And that's the only thing that I can possibly say that I think is positive about it. And I mean that at the state level as well as at the ground level. I've seen the sort of Dutch and the French and the Brits and the Germans trying to kind of put their heads together to kind of pool their funding and try and figure out things. So I wonder if there's you know, something sensible will come out of this. But I think that, you know, the US's leadership in this field and the way that the message that this has sent has been very damaging, because the other fact is that all of our international aid funding has also retracted in this very difficult climate. And you may have seen the news about the UK shifting its aid budget to this defense budget. And, you know, I don't think that humanitarian spending and war spending can really be distinguished in that way, that you know, investing in one prevents the other. So it sort of seems a bit backward. Just the other point was that as I was mentioning before we opened up, I was at the ICC last week, and my experience of the ICC has generally been that it's running on fumes. And I think we're now running on the kind of very, very top vapors, because it was just bleak. And I felt that there were two dynamics going on. One, a sort of defeatism, people just exhausted of constantly fighting for funding, constantly fighting for something to happen, you know, and they work really, really hard in under-resourced circumstances and with a lot of public backlash. But then also a galvanizing kind of, you know, I'm going to fight these sanctions. I'm going to fight. We're just going to keep fighting. We have to. And hats off to them for that. But it felt really, really, I don't want to say empty. That's not quite the right word, but it felt pretty bleak. And that's the first time I've been there in difficult circumstances before, but last week was yeah, tough one, and everyone was expecting a full sanction So yeah, so it's not an easy time, and I'm not sure I've ever seen an easy time in international law, but I keep hearing about the 90s and how wonderful they were. So, but we'll get there. We'll get there back. Everyone will realize how essential this work is.
Thank you, Kirsty. And one of the questions in the chat is very much related to the ICC, in particular for junior attorneys as just starting out in their legal careers. If you have any tips for how to strengthen their applications for joining, either as interns or as in junior level positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when Meg might have more comments on this, but when I was recruiting, the things that stood out to me were real demonstrations of actual commitment to human rights, not the I'm feathering my CV by having this experience on it, but here's the stuff that I've done that demonstrates that I really care about fair trial issues and I really care about victims' issues or whatever it is. And any experience you've got that supports that, then I think that would be extremely helpful. We are always looking for people who've got practical experience. So if you've done any kind of law clinic work, the US tradition of this is amazing. It's something that's not that common elsewhere, but it's an amazing opportunity for you to do ground level work that will really shine on your applications. Yeah. I think awareness of the nature of the work. In fact, in hiring kind of mid-level positions, I found that corporate law and commercial law, as we'd call it, work is actually quite relevant to looking at structures of things and the kinds of things that we worry about in international criminal law. So I think it would be any advocacy experience you've got, your written advocacy experience, any mooting, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think for me, it's commitment that I'm looking for and genuineness, because I think you can divide lawyers generally into those driven by ego and those driven by the work. I want to see that you're driven by the work. And being a team player, I've binned the perfect application because I can sense from the tone that they won't be a good team player. So that's it.
Thank you for that. So we have time for one more. I'm going to do a sort of set of questions that are all sort of interrelated, and they have to do with breaking into the field, international law as a young attorney. And Kirsty, I really appreciate your shout out to clinics as a clinician myself and getting some, practice experience even while you're in law school through that route. But the question has to do with, how do I break in and find the resources in particular to break in, given that there was another question around how sometimes these internships in the human rights field are often unpaid. There's a lot of expectation for free labor. And then, of course, this privileges certain people over others who might have those resources and results in a non-inclusive process, perhaps, for those who are trying to break into the field. So how do people get that practical experience? How do they break in? Do you have any tips otherwise for just getting your foot in the door in general in your respective fields? And maybe Meg and Denise, you want to start us off?
Sure. It's tough. I think it's important to emphasize that this is not an easy endeavor to break into international law, but I like how Kirsty said earlier that it was international law or nothing, right? If you have that kind of commitment, then you just keep at it, and you know that it will eventually work out, even though you might have some setbacks and frustrations along the way. The main thing I would say is network, network, network. And the best way to get your foot in the door, and it is too bad that a lot of these internships are unpaid, the internships that get you in the door as a very junior person. Unfortunately, that's linked to the lack of resources. So it's hard to see a way around that unless you can get fellowships. There are fellowships in the US, at least I know of some, like I want to say like a Rotary, and I can't remember what they are anymore. And I think they've even changed since I was looking, but there are fellowships that can pay you to do a human rights related internship. So that's one thing to think about. But the main thing I would say is network, because that is everyone I talk to, that is one of the most common ways of getting a job is because and it's not that you're not qualified, but it's because your application got to the top of an incredibly big stack of applications because somebody recommended you. And so having as many conversations with people in the field who you think might be able to mentor you or give you. And I saw somebody in the question saying, would you be willing to talk to me? Yes, absolutely. Reach out. I am available. I won't speak for the other two, but or three, but I'm happy to, and I take random, calls, I shouldn't say random, but calls from people that just find me on the internet, on a regular basis, to do this kind of work. Because as I said at the beginning, mentoring was one of the most important things in my career. So I enjoy the opportunity to pay it forward. Don't think that you, are, an inconvenience or worry about taking up time and so on, because it's really a joy to pay it forward when we've benefited so much from other women helping us or other people helping us.
Thank you. Denise, do you want to say a few quick words? We're at the top of the hour.
I would certainly chime in with internships if you're already still in law school, fellowships, not just looking at international organizations at IGOs, but also looking at NGOs as a way. Not that that's easy either, but it doesn't have to always be starting in the intergovernmental sphere. And then actually, in terms of the networking piece, just trying to go to conferences, including ASIL conferences, and any other opportunity that you might have as a way of meeting people and being able to engage on some substantive topics that are being discussed, because that'll help to show the level of interest.
Thank you so much. And so that brings us to the top of the hour. I'm sorry that we have to end without getting through all of the questions, but I do want to echo what Meg said. I am available if you want to reach out by email, and we can talk more directly. I just want to also echo what Denise said and Meg with regard to the network. And I always tell my students that literally I got all of my jobs through mentors, through the American Society of International Law Network. So join networks like that, and participate where you can while you're in law school. Really, really find those professors in the building that have some kind of similar interests to yours, because those people have the connections to help open doors. And, many professors, I know probably Denise and Meg would say the same, here in the US, are very committed to fundraising through their different centers and institutes to try to support fellowships, and then just leave no stone unturned. I had to be very creative with regard to, my loans and finding scholarships and funding to try and make internships happen. It does take a lot of hard work, and it's a long distance run. But if you're really committed, there are many of us who want to pay it forward and who do want to help open doors for you. So please reach out. I want to thank the American Society of International Law for all of their support for today's event, particularly Jimmy and Britta for making this webinar possible, for all of you for attending, and just do please follow WILIG and keep an eye out for our future events. We'd love to meet you in person. And I want to thank our wonderful panelists for being here today, for offering their insights. And I want to wish you all a